Excited that you're all here today for our conversation about challenging misinformation and stereotypes through Israel education. We're joined by our three panelists today, Daphne from the University of Hawaii, Ron Hassner from University of California, Berkeley, and Scott Spitzer from California State University, Fullerton. And yes, I'm excited for this presentation. I will start with Daphne first.
Welcome.
Oh, Daphne, you're muted.
I would like to begin by offering my deepest thanks to Miriam and Spencer and Trey here, Naomi, Rafa, and Josh, members of the AN leadership team, and to AN members, Frida, Ayal, and Edna, who was just here. I think she popped out, who along with many others, too numerous to name here, have played a significant part in a 7-year-long journey that brought me to this moment, one in which I could even begin to attempt to address the topic of our panel this afternoon. Oh, okay. I just got a notification that I've been disabled to share my screen, but I will be able to do that for the PowerPoint.
1 second.
Okay. Okay.
All right. You go ahead and try it now.
Okay. Okay, we're good. So as I was saying, they all have played a significant part in the 7-year-long journey that brought me to this moment, one in which I could even begin to attempt to address the topic of our panel this afternoon, challenging stereotypes through Israel education. This journey from experiencing concern and consternation in almost total isolation to finding a platform from which to speak in various communities from whom to draw inspiration, information, and support has been nothing short of transformative. It is this story of this slow, often uneven, but nevertheless significant transformation that I would like to share with you today in hopes that it can potentially serve as one case study among many. Thus, the title of my talk, Scenes from Hawaii, challenging the narrative of Israel as quote unquote America's favorite blind spot. First, a note about my approach and methodology. I'm not a historian nor a political scientist. I'm a tenured associate professor in English, an English department with a specialization in rhetorics, argumentation, nonfiction, biography, autobiography. And 20 years ago, I was able to propose and defend a dissertation about my mother's grandfather, Mordechai Ben-Ami, who was a writer, a journalist, and a member of the First Zionist Congress, who escaped the Russian pogroms, fled to Geneva, and eventually immigrated to Tel Aviv in the 1920s. Not only did my mentors allow me to write on letters he wrote to my grandfather, one of them told me, "This is your life's work." These days, in the academic circles I run in, Zionism is regularly equated with racism. BDS is supported at the highest levels of administration and is a commitment held by the majority of faculty in the humanities and social sciences. Israel is considered an apartheid state, and I, the daughter of a Holocaust survivor, am primarily considered as a Jewish American, both quote unquote white and privileged. Before I get to recent events at my home institution, I would like to place my 20 years at the University of Hawaii at Manoa in the context of what has occurred at American universities during this time. I offer as an illustration 3 Harvard Crimson editorials, the first published in 2002, the most recent in 2022. In 2002, the editors of the Crimson argued that because of its power and its bluntness, divestment should be used sparingly, and they offer specific reasons against divesting from Israel. At the moment, Israel is attempting to defend its citizens and its borders from terrorist attacks, as is the right of any sovereign state. This proposal for divestment once again makes Israel the victim of a double standard. Israel is not the only nation that takes strong and forceful action in times of war, yet it is consistently singled out for criticism. There's no doubt that divestment is a powerful tool capable of positive change when used properly. It is a moral and economic lever that can coerce people and nations to change unjust practices. But this powerful level is also a blunt tool Divestment squeezes all the citizens of the target country, whether or not they agree with the government's decisions. And in this age of globalization and multinational companies, divestment also affects workers in other countries. By 2022, the discourse had shifted to one that is decidedly more pathos than logos driven. The editor's opening with "The desire for rightful justice spreads like wildfire, moving us to act, to speak, to write, and to right our past wrongs." Many similarly broad appeals to emotion follow, with the focus of the editorial not being an argument in support of BDS primarily, but rather a claim to victim status for its writers. Israel remains America's favorite First Amendment blind spot. Companies that choose to boycott the Jewish state or otherwise support the pro-Palestine boycott, divest, and sanction movement face legal repercussions in at least 26 states. Even for journalists, openly condemning the state's policies poses an objective professional risk. Only last year, the Associated Press prompted outcry after firing a news editor over college-age tweets critical of Israel. The controversial decision followed a long-established pattern: dare question Israel's policies or endorse Palestinian freedom, and you will be shunned from the newsroom. Past accomplishments or legitimate arguments be damned. For college students like ourselves, speaking bluntly about events in the region can prompt online harassment or even land you on a blacklist. I could argue that opponents of BDS face similar harassment and shunning in the overwhelmingly pro-Palestinian academic circles I run in, but that is beside the point. The students fail to make the argument that needs to be made. Why boycott, divest, or sanction? What do these terms encompass? What is the effect of them? What does a quote unquote free Palestine mean? What has been the role of Palestinians in either promoting or hindering the peace process? Amidst many emotional calls for quote unquote peace, justice, and righteous action, there's little in the way of analysis, evidence, argument making. For that, one has to turn to the editorial written in response by one lone editor, Ms. Natalie Kahn, who is unafraid to point out the lack of evidence accompanying the rallying cries her colleagues are so susceptible to and rely upon so heavily. But dialogue, Ms. Kahn explains, is not the goal of BDS. They rely instead on substance and platitudes like Zionism is racism, settler colonialism, white supremacy, apartheid. The goal is demonizing Israel and delegitimizing its right to exist. A claim she offers substance support for by not only offering counter arguments, but also by providing necessary links to relevant sources. If you doubt me, ask its founders. Definitely, most definitely, we oppose a Jewish state in any part of Palestine, said co-founder Omar Barghouti, who also declared that Palestinians have a right to resistance by any means, including armed resistance. Perhaps the editorial board would agree, since its piece fails to condemn Palestinian terrorism or the chart of Hamas that explicitly calls for the annihilation of the Jewish people. How many members of the editorial board can tell me the story of Israel's history? Numerous peace treaties the Palestinians have rejected, human shields used by Hamas to gaslight Israel, and thousands of Israeli civilians murdered by terrorists. What about the millions of dollars used by the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank for the pay-to-slay program, rewarding terrorists for crimes against Israelis? One lone, thankfully articulate and well-versed voice up against so much wiping away of the particulars of history. When in 2015, I first was stunned into silence and confusion by the preponderance of pro-Palestinian events offered by my and allied departments, many of which offered material I considered imbalanced and misleading, I turned to a colleague in the history department for support. By the next year, he'd found a place for me on the Hillel Hawaii board. So my first bit of advice is to find a knowledgeable and well-connected faculty ally at your institution, even if it is, as in my case, only one. I want now to quickly walk you through some of our more highly published skirmishes. Due to time constraints, I'll only be able to briefly mention a few key highlights, snapshots of what has taken place on my campus. Leila Khaled is a member of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine and played a role in the TWA Flight 840 hijacking in 1969. Members of my and allied departments invited her to speak. after she was not allowed to do so at San Francisco State over Zoom in October 2020. Hillel International reached out to the Hillel Hawaii Board, and two of us, my faculty ally and myself, contacted the university administration to request that Khaled not be given a platform. Our request was denied. However, Zoom refused to host her talk, which resulted in the following video produced by and featuring members of upper administration, department chairs, including my own, and my colleagues in English, ethnic studies, political science, and American studies. And I don't have time to show it to you, but it's available upon request. As an example of the ways in which the argumentation on this issue has been less than subtle, I offer the following exchange over Twitter. When a young Israeli man, as someone invested in the peace process and someone who had posted his interviews with young Palestinian men, tweeted in May 2021, a graphic that read, "Israeli Lives Matter," an assistant professor from our political science department tweeted, "Kindly go fuck yourself," in response. The latest skirmish took place in March of this year. A poster announcing a BDS speaker and series of events offers the following version of Israeli history. Israel's founding in 1948 was a result of premeditated ethnic cleansing campaigns across historic Palestine, with the goal of displacing and dispossessing indigenous Palestinians of their land. Successive Israeli governments, with the financial and political backing of the US, have given Israel the green light to expand and entrench its colonial project from Gaza to Jerusalem. This time, instead of being able to name only one colleague as an ally, due to my time as a faculty fellow at Brandeis with the Schusterman Center for Israel Studies the previous summer, and due to my travel to an AEN conference this fall, I had substantial faculty and institutional support. In addition, because I had hosted a speaker sponsored by AEN in January, who's here, came in from Prague, and gave 2 public lectures with related interviews to the local media in February, I had community connections to local congregations and Jewish organizations that were not previously in place. And because our newly appointed student director of Hillel Hawaii is a staunch supporter of Israel, like-minded students knew better how to find my one colleague and myself. We had a team, and thus the Jewish Community Relations Board was launched. This is a diverse group, spanning an age gap of 28 to 82, some Americans, some Israelis, all Jewish, politically ranging from the progressive left to somewhere I am imagining on the right. We had sometimes little in common, other than our dismay at the events held and advertised. We favored differing responses and approaches, and each of us reached out to the communities we identified with the most. Thus, the organizations and communities we engaged with were greater than any of our own individual networks. Our preferred methods of response differed as well. Some of us attended the on-campus BDS recruitment workshop. Some of us attended the presentation at St. Andrew's, an Episcopalian church, and co-sponsored by Sabeel in peaceful protest, with flyers and posters of our own individual design in hand. One of us wrote to the church leadership who supports Sabeel and sponsored this talk. Some of us contacted the campus provost and the university presidents with our concerns. We all reached out to our networks for support and information. And we, with the help of these organizations, wrote as a board a formal letter to the university president and chancellor, which asked the following: how can Jewish members of the UH system who view an attachment to Israel as central to their identities as Jews feel welcomed and respected in these departments at UHM and the UH system at large when departments and programs sponsor such events? What is the UH administration's current plan for ensuring that the university community is aware of the UH system commitment to open inquiry, pluralism, and academic freedom, despite the fact that 5 UHM departments are sponsoring a campus event to promote academic boycotts? What can the UH administration do to counteract the use of inaccurate, inflammatory, and misleading misinformation? Please note that the language on the flyer for the March 5th event includes a description of Israel's founding that has been deemed by the Anti-Defamation League as inflammatory and anti-Semitic, and as inaccurate and misleading by historians who are experts in the field. And we offer the following possibilities to address our concerns: a statement in advance of the event, acknowledging that it will cause great pain for many Jews on campus, including those who support Palestinian rights and peace. A statement that acknowledges that all Jews are welcome in the UH system, and that the administration recognizes that for many Jews on its campuses, a connection to Israel is central to their identity. Events attacking identities, while they may appear to fall under protected speech on public universities, are hurtful and go against community values to provide an inclusive campus that respects everyone's experiences. Funds to host an alternative event with a prominent speaker, which will provide students, the campus community, and the community at large with a different viewpoint on the complexities of Israel and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. One that questions BDS as a strategy for conflict resolution and coexistence, offering other models. Funds to host a forum that addresses misinformation campaigns, the mainstreaming of conspiracy theories, and the role of the university to counter such misinformation, especially when it occurs on campus or at department-sponsored events. One of the first positive outcomes is that the group sponsoring the events sent out a revised poster prior to the event. The Hawaii chapter of Students and Faculty for Justice in Palestine no longer appears as a sponsor, and the inflammatory and accurate language regarding Israel's founding has been removed. Another positive result is that for the first time in 7 years, the president of UH responded to emails of concern regarding BDS events, including the following letter to the JCRB. Some crucial language includes the following. Universities must uphold both academic freedom within our institutions and freedom of speech for all. The award events were not the first and will not be the last on our campus or sponsored by campus groups on this or related topics. It is important to remember that no school, department, student organization, or academic association with which we may be affiliated represents the views of the university. We encourage our students, faculty, staff, and community members to learn from speakers they both agree with and disagree with. And we encourage those within the university who disagree with the speaker to organize events that present alternate views and perspectives. I got a report that some of you protested before at least one of the Awad events peacefully and respectfully, and engaged with the speaker peacefully and respectfully. That's the kind of behavior that I hope for and am proud of within our community. Notably, there is also in the letter a nod to acknowledging Israel's special status as a frequent target of academic boycotts. As is the case on other college campuses, BDS continues to be both opposed and supported by different groups. Support for a diversity of perspectives on controversial topics like BDS is a critically important facet of university life. If anything, approaches like BDS are likely to be debated more intensely as academics consider the positions and actions of governments, including North Korea, China, and Russia. Also encouraging for the students on our board was this admission of potential harassment, creation of a hostile environment, and/or intimidation. Differences of opinion, even strong differences, may, but most often do not result in creation of a hostile environment. But we take all allegations of intimidation quite seriously. Any UH employee who feels that they are being intimidated should contact our EEOC director. Students not covered under EOC should contact our UHM civil rights specialist if they experience harassment, intimidation, or other forms of discriminatory behavior. This is the first recognition that we have of any of these complaints in 7 years. It's the first time he's written us back at all, any of us. In 2 short months, the JCRB could count among its accomplishments the following: revised poster, letter from the UH president. In fall 2022, we will host Gadi Wolfsved as the speaker. In spring 2023, we have invited Yosef Haddad and Emily Schrader to come to campus. In fall 2022, we're working with Stand With Us to provide some workshops to counter BDS workshops. There's a meeting with the Israeli embassy in the works. Materials on anti-Semitism have now been included on the university-wide Race and Bias Commission. I serve there as the chair of the education, co-chair of the education committee. And I'll also just quickly point to 2 courses that are currently in the works. So briefly, here are course descriptions of 2 classes, one at the undergraduate level that's been approved and is pending assignment, and one at the graduate level that is slated for 2024 on relevant materials. And I'm glad to forward those to anyone upon request. In closing, I am not a historian and I am not a political scientist. I'm professionally invested in argument and in storytelling. And over the past 7 years, I've become increasingly more concerned about the quality and the accuracy of the prevailing discourses in my and allied departments. My advice to anyone similarly positioned is to 1, find even just one ally at your institution. 2, reach out to these national organizations. 3, attend relevant conferences. 4, apply for grants and fellowships. 5, give public lectures so that you can find your community. 6, agree to be interviewed, as scary as it might be. 7, publish and teach in related areas. 8, host speakers and organize events. And 9, reach out to local community organizations. And 10, be true to your interests and your concerns. As challenging as this transformation has been and continues to be, my teaching, research, community outreach, and work with graduate and undergraduate students have never been so aligned. I wish you much success should you decide to embark on a similar journey. And more importantly, if you ever find yourself feeling discouraged and isolated, I do hope that you'll give me a call. Thank you. Tada, tada, rabba.
Daphne. All right. Move on to Ron.
Thank you, Daphne. That was fantastic, and thank you all for having me. I'm delighted to speak again at AEN. The struggles and successes that Daphne describes sort of remind me of the situation we had at Berkeley maybe 15, 20 years ago, and it was a really, really tough period. So in a way, what you will hear from me is sort of the next step. My blessing to you, Daphne, and all your colleagues that this will indeed be the next step, because I think what you're about to hear from me should shed some optimism on your endeavors. So first of all, my name is Ron Hassner. I'm a political scientist. I'm one of the directors of the Helen Diller Institute for Jewish Law and Israel Studies on the Berkeley campus, which we now are claiming, though we can't prove it, but we're just going to continue claiming it, is the biggest Israel Studies Institute in the United States. And we have some good reasons to claim it. Our institute is now into its 11th year. And mostly what the Institute does, and I'm saying this by way of background, is to bring scholars from Israel to Berkeley to teach their classes across campus. Anywhere from 5 to 10 to 15 scholars every year teaching 2 or 3 classes across campus. We have undergraduate fellows, about 20, who work with our institute. We do public events, we do seminars and workshops, and the faculty that is permanently on the Berkeley campus teaches a whole range of permanent classes on Israel. In terms of what can be done to strengthen the fair and professional study of Israel on campus, I'd like to talk about sort of two levels. The one I can talk about briefly, because Daphne addressed it so well, is the sort of institutional level. And here we've done 2 things. First of all, exactly as Daphne proposed, we've created a network of people on campus who share a concern with Jewish values, who share a concern with academic rigor, everything AEN stands for. And together with community members, together with students, together with administrators, we've created a committee. It's called the Chancellor's Committee on Jewish Life, with the participation of very high up members of the administration. We meet at least once every semester to discuss any issues of concern. Why isn't there more kosher food? How do we persuade professors that Passover is a real holiday that actually takes 8 days, and that students can't take an exam on the first and last day? How do we deal with an upcoming vote in the somewhere in the university that may cause tensions? The committee doesn't necessarily resolve these issues, but it allows people to air their views. It allows the administration to see what is concerning to students from this side of campus, from the other side of campus. It can hear about how community members feel about this, and faculty can offer support. And we've actually managed to address several issues of concern and fend them off before they become real matters of trouble. And often, as you all understand, it's much easier to deal with these issues before they explode on campus and prevent them from reaching the campus level than it is to do damage control after the fact. So it allows people to raise alarm bells. It allows people to point out opportunities for funding. It allows people from the nearby Jewish community to have a stake in that conversation. The other thing we do at the institutional level is the work the Institute does. And here, I think the insight from my colleagues, this was not my idea, but it was a great idea, was that we bring these people from Israel, but we not keep them inside our institute. We send them out across campus to teach in the various departments that they belong to. So if we have many more applicants every year than we can accept, but if, say, we accept a professor of drama, journalism, education, sociology, we don't keep them in the law school in our little office, but we ensure that they have an office in the performing arts, in the journalism school, in the sociology department, where they can teach courses that are part of the official university catalog. That allows that scholar the opportunity of networking among like-minded people, engage in their network to their own benefit. It allows them to get at the students where the students are. So rather than try to drag the students into our institute, we send scholars out towards the students. And most of the students who take a class on, high tech in the Middle East, or we've had classes on disability and the performing arts. We've had classes on museum design. They don't need to know, and they don't care that their professor comes from Israel. They know that it's a professor who's visiting in their department, who's teaching a class, and they get course credit for it. And so they don't have to trek to us, because as you all know from interacting with your students, it would never occur to them to leave their home base and walk even 15 feet. So rather, we come to them. And the significance of this, I think, is that we take an interdisciplinary and a multifaceted approach. Most of the professors we host do not teach Israel the problem. They don't, some of them teach ethnic issues in Israel, immigration in Israel, Israeli-Palestinian conflict, Arab-Israeli conflict. There are some who do that, but most of them teach just about everything. Everything. Economics in Israel, innovation in Israel, agriculture, law, any academic topic you can imagine, art, culture, sociology, anthropology, discourse, history, each and every aspect, which I think is important, because part of the effort to either valorize Israel in a way that's unrealistic, or defame Israel in a way that's unrealistic, is to always teach Israel through the same lens, which is always the lens of conflict and terrorism. Now, it happens to be what I study. I'm very interested in it. In no way do I want to malign the study of international conflict. I specialize in religion and violence and Israel, so it's all I do. But it's not how we teach Israel. It is one way in which we teach Israel. But we are just as interested in touching on other problematic aspects of Israel, which are no less problematic, but which are invisible to the American eye. Gender and injustice in Israel, ethnicity and injustice in Israel, religious diversity within Israel, among Jewish groups and among Jews and non-Jews. I think that diversity is very, very important. I think it's very important that students learn about land use in Israel, architecture in Israel, all of which have their own areas of problems. At some point in most of these classes, some aspect of the creation of Israel, sectarian issue, ethnic issues is bound to come up, but it's not the main focus of the class. And I think it's good to have both, not to shy away from the difficult issues, but to offer a broader list. So that's at two institutional levels, both our relations with our colleagues and with the administration and the creation of allies, and at the level of this institute. And we have fundraised now through the institute for summer classes in Israel, internships in Israel. I'm going to start taking a group of Berkeley students together with Stanford students on Israel trips together. We've been able, through our energy and through the fact that we're growing and have succeeded in what we do, to advise colleagues at nearby universities, both at Stanford and in Washington State, on how to do what we do on a smaller level. So that's the first half of my comments. The second half of my comments is about my own teaching of Israel. Not to shy from controversy, I teach Berkeley's introductory war class, which on the Berkeley campus is interesting enough. That tends to be about 200, 300 students. There's then a sequel class called War in the Middle East. And it's important that it's a sequel. It's intentionally a sequel because it requires students who take the more controversial War in the Middle East class to have spent a semester with me and understand what my standards are, what a rigorous conversation looks like, how you evaluate evidence, how political science is different from politics, why you don't scream at one another, but engage in debate, how you never just offer one argument, but you also look at multiple arguments side by side. So that class tends to be smaller. It's merely 100, 150 students. Students who don't like the way I teach don't take that class. Students who are not open-minded, students who are not willing to debate their opinions don't take that class. And yet it's always full. So I find that perhaps precisely because we're in an era where students and faculty silence one another, where politics is becoming divisive and polarized, and there's a tendency to avoid engaging with people whose opinions you disagree with. I think that perhaps precisely because of that attitude, students find my alternative refreshing, where there's always conflict and there's always disagreement. I'll give one small example, and this gets to the topic of interlocutors, which I think is a very important topic. The reader, insofar as there is a reader for my Middle East class, is a book called Arabs and Israelis. Many of you may be familiar with it, which is authored by 3 different authors, an Egyptian, a Palestinian, and an Israeli, who write each and every chapter in the book from 3 different voices. I can use the term with you. I can't use it with my students, but it's sort of a Rashomon book. My students have no idea what that is, right? It's multiple voices that cannot be reconciled. It drives the students completely insane, and they're desperate to know who's right, and they need to hear the answer. Who says anybody's right? They might all be wrong. They might all be lying to you. It wakes up a voice in their head that progressive politics has put to sleep, which is the voice that says, there is no single truth. It's okay to disagree. It's healthy, it's good. It's good to hear voices that you cannot abide by, that run against every instinct. And there are many, many opinions in that book that I cannot abide by, that are very hard for me to read, let alone to teach. So that's one way to bring interlocutors into the class. The other obvious way to bring interlocutors into the class is to bring speakers who speak from different points of view. They have to be sane. They have to be professional. They cannot be propagandists, for or against. I'm also very wary of falling into the trap, and my students would be delighted if I did that, of sort of simple representational politics, right? So this class is a good class to take because one of the professors is an Israeli and the other professor is a Palestinian. So it's diverse and so everything's great. That's not a trap I want to walk into at all. On the contrary, I want to convey the idea to them that a professional scholar has to, not just can, but has to represent multiple opinions. And so the interlocutors I bring into class are not necessarily Arabs or Palestinians or anti-Israelis or pro-Israelis. They are simply scholars who disagree with me or who maybe specialize in something that I don't specialize in. But they have to be people who are willing to engage with me and have professional discourse, professional conversations. When that happens, and I've seen it happen in the classroom, the students are amazed Because again, this is an entire generation of students that has not been exposed to healthy argument and debate between grown-ups. They've only seen grown-ups malign one another, or this is a person you can't possibly listen to because they're evil. They watch me engage with a guest in class the way one watches a tennis match at Wimbledon. I mean, they're just sort of, but Ron said something terrible to him, and instead of cursing or walking away, he's offering evidence, and Ron accepts some of that evidence, but Ron shoots down some other parts of the evidence and counters with evidence of his own. It simply opens up an entirely new world for them, and it demonstrates, in part, I think, my confidence in my opinions and how important it is for me to have them see Israel from multiple angles. There's one last thing I want to say in terms of sort of offering a diverse and open-minded point of view, and that is to always teach Israel from a comparative lens. So my class on war in the Middle East is not a class about the Arab-Israeli conflict, and it's certainly not a class about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It's a class about war in the Middle East. Iran-Iraq war, American occupations of Afghanistan and Iraq, the Moroccan occupation of Western Sahara, the Turkish occupation of Cyprus, the Iranian-Turkish occupation of Kurdistan, the war in Yemen, the civil war in Syria. If you're going to teach Israel, you have to teach it in context, both historical context. So I'm amazed at my many colleagues for whom the history of Israel starts in 1917. It's raining Jews. Where are they coming from? What are they doing here? What the hell are Jews doing here? This is a Muslim country. So I start my classes on Israel, I'd say about 2000 BC, and slowly work my way forward. But also geopolitical context. Okay, there's an important occupation happening in both the West Bank and Gaza, and some would even say the Golan. How does that compare to other occupations in the Middle East? There's terrorism happening in Israel. How does it compare to terrorism elsewhere in the Middle East? How do the wars that Israel has fought compare to the wars its neighbor has fought? It helps put these things in context. Again, not to valorize Israel, but also not to set Israel apart as some sort of aberration. It's really helpful for students to hear that during 1 month of the Battle of Basra, at the height of the Iran-Iraq war, more soldiers died than in the entire Arab-Israeli conflict, all 100 years of it. 1948, 1956, 1967, 1973, the entire Israeli-Palestinian conflict, all of that stuff piled on top of one another, less fatalities than in 1 month of the Iran-Iraq war. It puts things in context. I think context is important. So I'll finish there, and if my parting message, I guess, would be, once you've overcome the defensive stage, which is, I think, the stage that Daphne described, sort of the transition from being on the defense, reacting to events on campus, and trying to change the discourse, you are then, I think, in the luxurious position of being in the constructive stage, in which you don't have to defend anyone, and you certainly don't have to apologize. But you can, in a constructive, provocative way, engage students by bringing the topic to them, teaching what interests them. I have students who are interested in desalination. I have students who are interested in civil-military relations. I have one of the best student papers in my class last semester was about feral cats in Israel. Why are there so many feral cats in Israel? It's a fantastic topic. Some students are interested in Israeli law. Some students are interested in constitutional issues in Israel. You bring the topic to them, and you teach them the aspects that are interesting to them. So I'm going to stop there.
Thank you, Ron. Okay. Second here.
I'm not repulsed by that.
All right, Scott, ready when you are.
Well, first of all, I'm so grateful to be asked to be part of this panel, and I'm already learning so much. And I've had similar experiences to both Daphne, and after hearing Ron, I'm like, I'm teaching my class totally incorrectly. So I'm really glad I'm here. But I did want to talk to you about, as Daphne pointed out sort of, and I wanted to thank AEN for bringing me into this incredibly important organization, which is really aligned with the way I look at things, because I'm really, first and foremost, an optimist about the capacity of education to really transform the way people get locked into these very extremist and uninformed positions on the most controversial issues. Now, my training, I want to start by saying my background, I got my PhD in political science at Columbia in 2000, and it's in American government, and I study social welfare policy and politics and racial politics, and the connection between the two. So my doctoral dissertation was about welfare in the United States. So but as a committed practicing Jew, and I ended up marrying a cantor who also is now a rabbi, and I've always been concerned and committed to, to the protection of Israel. That's been a very important part of just who I am. And when I got to Cal State Fullerton on the tenure track in 2006, I realized that nobody was really teaching a class on the Arab-Israeli conflict, and I just kept waiting for somebody who's an expert to come to our class, to our university, to be able to teach that. And at one point, we hired somebody who had some background in Islamic extremism and terrorism, primarily in Indonesia, but she was going to teach. And for 1 year, she taught a class on the Arab-Israeli conflict. And then she went off to Gallaudet University, and there we were. And so in the history department, we have had a couple of people teaching courses in modern Middle Eastern history, looked at their syllabi. There was literally zero on Israel. There was nothing on even the 1948 war in Israel. So, when the chair of the history department who taught that class retired, I decided maybe I ought to teach this class. And I came at it in a lot of ways selfishly, because I wanted to actually develop a course that would take students to Israel. And my background as a fairly progressive person was to sort of explore it from a number of different perspectives, raise people's awareness. So a friend of mine who was working at UC Irvine for a program called the Olive Tree Initiative, invited me in 2013. She said, we have this amazing program where we educate students on our campus in a semester-long course on the Arab-Israeli conflict. And then we go to Washington, D.C. They get introduced to leadership in the State Department, AIPAC, CARE, and then they go to Jordan and Palestine, West Bank, Palestine, and then to Israel, and they hear from leadership, business leadership, environmental leaders, and of course, political leaders from all sides of this issue, settlers to Palestinian Authority people, and everybody in between, and analysts. And she said, why don't you come on that? And I'm thinking to myself, I'm going to go on that trip, and what they do, I'm going to replicate. So I get on this trip, and you can see the itinerary here. And immediately I realized there's no way I could ever replicate this. The people they had on the ground, for example, we went to Hebron. In the morning, we went to the synagogue side. In the afternoon, went to the mosque side. We had a settler in Hebron guide us on this synagogue side. We had a Palestinian activist from Hebron in the afternoon, take us through the mosque. I don't have those contacts. I could never do that. So I started to think about, bringing my students at Cal State Fullerton to this Olive Tree Initiative trip, you can see I got this incredible education and exposure, direct exposure, which really made a big impression on me. It wasn't that I hadn't read about a lot of this stuff, but being in these places in Bethlehem, I'd never been to Bethlehem or the mosque or the Aidi refugee camp, or in Haifa. I'd never been to this incredible restaurant founded by which had been attacked in a terrorist bombing and rebuilt itself with a Jewish and Arab co-owner. I'd never been to Nazareth. We were at the Golan Heights, which was incredible, with a guide who could really point us about the strategic concerns that Israel had, and we could see it. And then we went all these, we went to Ariel settlement, Nablus, Jenin. We went to Sderot, Tel Aviv. You can see all these places we went to, including, and every place we went to, we were learning from, hearing from leadership, business leadership, environmental leadership. And that really shaped the way I wanted to teach anything that I was going to do in this. I ultimately ended up not doing a study abroad program, best laid plans. But you can see some pictures of me here in these different places on that trip. It was really fun, actually, recently to put together the slideshow and to look at all these old pictures from 2014 and relive that trip. That was, first of all, I will say this about the trip: it was exhausting. Our days were, really intense emotionally for me, and most of it was listening to hear all these different perspectives. And I come at this as a, conservative religious Jew, conservative meaning Jewish conservative, and I was hearing things that I didn't want to hear in a lot of places, that I completely thought was wrong, factually, but I'm not an expert. So I came back to the United States and I said, I want to develop a syllabus and read enough so that I feel that I could teach an undergraduate class at Cal State Fullerton. Mind you, and that took 3 more years till I felt that I was really ready to start to teach something like that. And honestly, to this day, I still feel ill-equipped to be offering that. But as I feel like, and I use the same book that Ron uses, which is an amazing textbook, which helps me immensely in teaching this. And I didn't always use that. I used a different textbook when I first started, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But I wanted to give you the context of Cal State Fullerton, because it's a huge community university, mostly. We do have some, 5,000 students who live on campus. It's a Hispanic serving institution, HSI, according to the federal government, Department of Education. It's incredibly diverse, Asian, Hispanic, you can see the populations. And there are a lot of low income first generation students on our campus as well. 32% of the campus is they're the first person in their family who ever went to college. So that's the context. Very few students on our campus are identifiable as Jewish. I have been the faculty advisor to the campus Hillel for a long time, and I'm on the board of the Orange County Hillel, which is the Hillel organization that serves University of California, Irvine, Chapman University, and Cal State Fullerton, all completely different universities. Research One, UC, a private liberal arts small school, Chapman, and a CSU, which is a 4-year mostly teaching, not focused primarily on research institution. Not to say that we don't do research here. So, a couple of things to note that, our Hillel is not a very strong Hillel. The biggest focus of our Hillel it's a countywide organization, as I mentioned, is on UC Irvine, where there have been a series of very high profile conflicts around Israel. And when Michael Oren, that came, ambassador from Israel at the time, and was shouted down, and there have been other, hate, basically apartheid weeks, Chapman has as a Holocaust Study Center, Holocaust Museum, and they've grown their Jewish population. So they have a pretty robust and active Hillel. Cal State Fullerton is, maybe 10 students. And most of the leadership comes from the staffing of the county Hillel. So that just gives you, so our Jewish population is relatively inactive, very small. We used to have a pretty robust AE Pi fraternity that used to have a lot of programming, and they kind of fell apart, and they're now defunct. Meanwhile, when I came to campus in 2006, right away, I noticed, like in 2007, 2008, there was this social justice week that we have at Cal State Fullerton. And the very first year I was there, they had a big event that was very pro-Palestinian. It wasn't so much anti-Zionist, but I remember looking at that and thinking, wow, what's that all about? And then I learned that there was an active Students for Justice in Palestine organization on campus, as well as a Middle Eastern Student Association, MESA. The SJP brings a huge apartheid wall with all sorts of misinformation and incorrect and factually just blatantly wrong information. I'm sure many of you are familiar with that exhibit. And they bring that every year and they put it right in the middle of our campus, right there. And so I would see that. And then, so I started to get concerned that there was no course about the Arab-Israeli conflict. There's this active SJP. Most of my students are not Jewish, and don't really have an awareness of any of this history or politics, and are going to be informed by whatever information comes out their way. So I went away on this trip, came back, and in 2015, the Women's History Week was introduced. The keynote speaker was Nora Ericott, who's one of the originators of the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement. The niece of Saeb Erekat, one of the PLO negotiators at Oslo, and she was giving the keynote, and it was very clear she was extremely sort of radicalized BDS speaker and very, very compelling, both. So before she got there to give the keynote, I saw that the president of our university was going to be introducing her, and I wrote a letter to the president, Garcia at the time, Mildred Garcia, and I said, you really don't want to be you really don't want to get on one side of this BDS issue. It's, here's examples of how it's exploded in the face of administrators all over the country. And she said, why don't you come to the event? I couldn't come. She kind of just poo-pooed it. And then the next morning, apparently, so I found out that Nora Ericott's remarks basically, in a nutshell, said something like, the reason why there's so much violence in Gaza and in the West Bank from Palestinian terrorists is because the occupation is so powerfully negative for family life that these men are rebelling. It was just horrible. And the president of the university was so upset that they called me the next morning at like 8 a.m. and said, what did you want to do again? Did you want to run another event? And they rented out the hotel next door to me. And I got together with Hillel and the Rose Project, which has been responding to some of the issues of anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism on UCI's campus. And we brought Mohammed Dajani, a Palestinian political science professor who had brought his students to Auschwitz and basically was forced out of Jerusalem, came to and so we brought him. He gave this talk, and I got Hillel there. I didn't realize how amazing this was, but I was able to get leadership from our Hillel and from our SJP at this event. Apparently that never happens. And I didn't find that until afterwards. But that was sort of my institutional response to this. And meanwhile, I'm trying to figure out how I'm going to teach this class. And I really want it to be, something which engages students in asking difficult questions, in hearing the discordant histories and narratives of Jews in Israel, Palestinians, et cetera, et cetera. And so I taught, focusing on, what my own discipline teaches me about empiricism, not normative assumptions, not value-based assumptions, but basically to ask questions and to subject those questions to analysis and tests with data and that kind of thing. That's sort of the approach I want to take, with an emphasis on historical accuracy, and to provide the best way I could do this was, and I came up with this on my own, really, was to say, okay, what's the perspective of Israelis? What's the perspective of Palestinians? What's the perspective of Egyptians and people in Lebanon, et cetera, et cetera. And that's how I constructed my my course. Originally, the book I used was by Charles Smith. It's in the 9th or 10th edition. Detailed, historical, not really polemical in any way, to my mind, but didn't teach very well, and it was hard for me to teach. But it gave me a really good grounding, in addition to the other studying I'd done in terms of teaching the history. Over the course of the time that I was teaching it, I hear somebody else talking. Am I going on too long or something? Or
You're good. You can keep going.
okay. So over the course of my the time that I was teaching that class, I was the very first time I was introduced to this to the textbook that Ron spoke about. And this is the new edition by an Israeli, a Palestinian scholar, an Israeli scholar, and a Palestinian scholar, and an Egyptian scholar, all at the really excellent scholars, political scientists, and historians, and doing public opinion research, all sorts of things, presenting these, presenting the sort of the core of the history on of the state of Israel, but also giving different narratives in each of these moments from an Israeli, Palestinian, Egyptian, and also tracing some of the larger contextual issues that Ron also mentioned. What are the roles of the great powers, the British, the Soviets, then later the Russians, the United States? What about other Arab countries like Iran and Iraq, and what role do those things have in shaping the Arab-Israeli conflict? I also decided to have two examples of fairly self-reflective scholarship journalism from an Israeli and from a Palestinian. And I chose these two books, My Promised Land by Ari Shavit, as a Israeli looking at the conflict, but acknowledging some of the human rights abuses of Israel, and writing about it beautifully. And Rashid Khalidi, who runs the Palestinian Center at Columbia University, a scholar of this. But his first book, The Iron Cage, is about the failures of Palestinian leadership in getting a state of their own within the context of, now both of these, as Ron said, I really like the way you put this, Ron, that teaching Khalidi, I teach this, and I don't like having to teach things that I completely disagree with, and for lots of reasons, not only just that I think it's a distortion effect, but also, but I want to give representation to the perspective of a scholarly treatment of the Palestinian views of Israel. And this is a very good one that does have some self-reflective criticism. Same thing on the Shavit side, which is much easier for me to teach personally. So the core, course, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time going through all the details. I provide some additional details for you to look at if you're interested. But the focus of the class then is to really offer these divergent narratives. of the Israelis, Palestinians. After we established sort of the historical, an accurate history of the origins of Israel, the British Mandate, 1948 war, the 1956 war, et cetera, all the way through past Oslo. In each of those moments, I have the students having to master Israeli, Palestinian, and other narratives and discuss that and represent that in class. We look at the conflict from a number of different dimensions: religious, ideological, political, and of course, look at it in the broader context. So this is sort of some examples of some of the ways that I shape it, right? So it's divided in a number of different parts. Palestine before Israel. I started the fall of the Ottoman Empire. I did not start in, thousands of years before that. But the point is that for most of my students, that's way earlier than they would ever begin to think about this. And I exposed them to, early Zionist thinking, Palestinian nationalism, which I illustrate was a much weaker sort of amorphous kind of approach to nationalism than the Zionist approach. And I talk about the pogroms, the history of that experience of Jews in Europe, Herzl, and we look at it from a number of different perspectives. When we do the War of Independence, I asked them to think about it from the perspective of independence and from the perspective of Nakba. I have representations of both. I look at it afterwards. I look at the Suez-Sinai War of 1956, the Six-Day War. We read some primary documents as well, the Yom Kippur War, Camp David, First Intifada, 1993 Oslo Accords, Oslo II, the failure of the final status negotiations, the Second Intifada, et cetera, all the way up to contemporary issues. This was last year's, a year and a half ago course. I'll probably change a lot of these readings when I teach it this fall. I also have every student pick at one of those moments and analyze a peace agreement, or even a failed one, and they can pick one of those. And I kind of make sure that there's the class is about 35 students, 40 students, that we have representation on each of these moments in each of these classes for students who have written about that peace agreement from both Arab and Israeli perspectives, how it was achieved, how it was succeeded, how it was failed, right? A lot of it is their own evaluation and analysis, but they will be asked in class to contribute a heavy part of the class discussion. So students are constantly exposed to thinking in mastering divergent and different and conflicting narratives of the same events to be able to talk about them in an articulate way. Then I ask them at the end to come up with a peace proposal of their own. And I explicitly say, you got to focus on borders, you got to focus on security, you got to focus on refugees, you got to focus on Jerusalem. And these are the Oslo Accords items that they wanted to focus on. And that they have to explicitly represent Palestinian and Israeli narratives of their past experiences with peace and conflict, and consider contemporary reality. So when they start to do that, they realize how difficult this is. So what is the result of all of this? I have a student body in my class that is I've had very few Jews. Most of my students are Hispanic Christians or Catholic or white Christians, Catholic, who think they might know something about it or maybe don't. I had a student who actually asked me, what's a Palestinian? And I said, that's an amazing question. And we had a whole class on how, different approaches to saying, who is a Palestinian, whether that's a real nationality, differences about that from the Israeli side, from Arab side. So I get all sorts of questions that illustrate to me that my student body really didn't understand the Holocaust. When I first started teaching this class and I talked about the Holocaust, I said, how many people you guys are familiar with the Holocaust? Tell me a little bit about the Holocaust. They said that's when Jews were persecuted in Europe. So I had to bring in a much more explicit set of images and detailed history of the Holocaust to explain the depravity and the extent of the Holocaust. None of them knew about early Zionist philosophy and accomplishments. None of them could put this in the context of world powers and the history of the Shoah and the pogroms before that. And so in a way, the course is a stealthy course because by exposing the students to all sorts of perspectives, including the Israeli perspective, including the Jewish perspective, they get exposed to the Jewish perspective and they can start to appreciate the importance of Israel for Jews. I mean, I'm just talking about it as a Jewish person. That's not my only goal here, but that is something that I couldn't help but be aware of, that was happening in my class. So that students, for example, didn't know that Israel had a huge amount of racial ethnic diversity, didn't know about Sephardi and Ashkenazi Jews, and didn't understand that the Sephardi Jews were more likely to be on the conservative side. And all of this politics was really interesting to see it digested by students who really came at it with very little information and leaving with some complex ideas about the Arab-Israeli conflict. In 2020, I just want to mention this before I finish. In 2020, I taught the class online, and it was an amazing student body. I had a Jordanian student, a Palestinian student. These are students in the United States from these countries, Saudi student, Egyptian student, along with the majority of Mexican American and white Protestant students. But these students from Jordan, Palestine, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia, oftentimes were happy to talk about their perspective, what they learned in their families, and how this course widened their perspective. It was a really positive set of discussions. And people wrote some really interesting papers about their peace agreements in the end. So for the future, I'm hoping to create a virtual travel course that would echo many of the things that we did on my olive tree course, including going to a synagogue, going to a mosque, going to an Israeli restaurant, Middle Eastern restaurant, having those kinds of experiences here in Orange County, as well as seeing videos and things like that, and experiencing music, as well as the history. In addition, Ed Royce, who's the retired senior House of Representatives who used to chair the Foreign Relations Committee in the House, has a symposium that he's established, and in years past, so far we've had it. Last year, this past spring, we did it on Ukraine and Russia. This coming spring, there may be other topics, but I'm hoping to involve some of my students in my class to do some poster presentations as part of that symposium. In addition, I've been asked by a number of people. My wife as a rabbi is very involved in interfaith communal leadership in Orange County. She's the president of the Orange County Interfaith Network. And she's asked me, a number of people have asked me, not just her, if they could take my class and whether we could do that as a prep for a interfaith community trip to Israel and Palestine. And so I'm hoping to partner with the person who organized the OTI program to set something up like that in the next couple of years. So that's where I'm at right now. And I'm very excited to talk with you more about these things.
Thank you all so much for sharing your presentations. We can open it up to questions from the group here, and the microphones are on the table. Go ahead, Jared.
Hi, I have a comment and a question for Ron. Is everyone? Are they
Want to introduce yourself as well?
Oh, I'm sorry. Hi, Jared Tanney. I teach Jewish history at UNC Wilmington in North Carolina. I have a comment and a question for Ron specifically. First of all, I do agree with you about teaching Israel from some sort of comparative perspective or framework. So my course that I teach is, I call it Zionism in Modern Israel, right? So I don't go back to 2000 BC exactly. But, I do start, with Europe and the Enlightenment and the seeming failure of emancipation. And most importantly, the rise of nationalism in the face of anti-Semitism. And I think that helps the students see Zionism as European in a certain way, but a form of ethno-nationalism. And I think this is very useful for a couple of reasons. One, when it comes time to looking at the Palestinians, which I am by no means an expert on, and I'm certainly not an expert on Middle Eastern history, since my training's in Europe, it allows them to, at the very least, see the Palestinian perspective. It does give them that because they understand the culturally constructed nature of nationalism. But also, I think it's useful because it sort of pulls the rug out under from the argument that Israel is nothing but a settler colonialist enterprise, because if they could, see that there is a foundation to Israel being an ethno-national community, like all these other groups that, quotes, for lack of a better term, awakened in the 19th century, it just undermines the notion that this is nothing but European imperialism, pure and simple. So I do like approaching it from that way. Plus, with no training in Middle Eastern history, I'd be seen as a fraud otherwise if I tried to do a course purely on the conflict or on a history of Israel in the Middle East or something. My question for you is specifically about Berkeley. I did my PhD at Berkeley, and I finished in 2008 in the history department, doing Russian and Jewish history. And, at the time, Berkeley, before your center was created, had a very large Jewish studies program with interdisciplinary degrees. I was a TA the semester when they started the undergraduate minor. The first time they taught the Intro to Jewish Studies class, I was the TA, and it was a complete and utter disaster, the course. And you had these real heavy hitters, strong personalities in this program, many of whom militant anti-Zionists, many of whom did not get along with each other. It was a very fractious program, and firmly entrenched in certain respects. So I'm wondering how. And then a few years later, I read about the creation of your center, and I'm just wondering about how that works. Is that other Jewish studies entities still there? Do the two of you work together? Is there conflict? Having
Thank
to do
you.
with Zionism or not? Or more, territorial issues?
Thank you. Great question. So as for the first point, yes, I think the comparative analysis is crucial. I would have gone even a step further than you, Jared, and had said, yes, this idea of nationalism as a European invention, that's true for Palestinian nationalism as well.
Yeah.
Right. And so, for example, I have an entire lecture on anti-colonial struggles: the Palestinian anti-colonial struggle, the Algerian anti-colonial struggle, and the Jewish anti-colonial struggle. I won't even dignify this notion of Jews being colonizers with a lecture, because it's very clear from the historical context that their effort is primarily anti-colonial and not colonial. Yeah. So I think the context is important. As for your question about Berkeley politics, since we are being recorded, I'm going to. I
didn't mention any names. That's why.
I'm going to walk around it tenderly and just say it has always made sense, and it continues to make sense, I think, on any campus, that Jewish studies be separate from Israel studies, for the same reason that Buddhist studies is separate from Chinese studies, and Russian Orthodox studies is separate from Russian studies. Mm-hmm. There have been retirements at Berkeley. There have been new hires at Berkeley. The landscape in that sense has changed in all sorts of interesting ways. I would say there's a massive overlap in the Center for Jewish Studies and the Israel Institute. I should say there's a third body on campus, which is the Magnus Jewish Museum. Right. We are the only university in the US that has its own Jewish museum. So again, there's an overlap between all three entities, but it's not a perfect overlap. Right. And there are many people in any department on our campus that wish us well, and some that are disinterested, and some that explicitly do not wish us well. And much of what we do at the Israel Institute has nothing to do with Judaism. Absolutely nothing. And so that's why we keep these bodies separately. But you will not be surprised to hear that the flourishing has happened across those three communities in parallel. That as Jewish students who do have a Zionist identity have been able to hold themselves high, they have brought their friends in to take more classes in Jewish studies, to learn more about Judaism, to learn Hebrew, to study Hebrew poetry, and side-by-side Israeli poetry. These things buoy one another, I think, in very positive ways.
So if someone were to take a Hebrew class, it wouldn't be under the auspices of your
both.
Okay.
Sometimes Hebrew is taught at the, what is it called? The Department for Near Eastern
Near Eastern
Studies.
studies, yeah.
Sometimes it's taught inside Jewish studies. Sometimes it's taught through the Israel Institute. It happens across all levels, with no friction that I can attest to.
Great.
Are these microphones?
Yeah, yeah.
Yes. Hello, this is Jeffrey Herf. And this is a question actually for all three of you, but I think one of the successes of the anti-Zionist campaigns of recent decades is to delegitimize the reading of Israeli historians and scholars who are Zionists. And I noticed on your syllabi that, and maybe they're there and you didn't show them, that there are no readings by Benny Morris, Tuvia Freeling, Meyer Litvak, Anita Shapiro, Zvi Alpeleg, Uwe Bialer, Shlomo Slonim, and there are other names that could go on. And Professor Spitzer in particular. You were so balanced that I think the Zionist, not narrative, but simple Zionist history is not very evident in your course. And Ron, the comparative perspective is certainly welcome and crucial, but I am concerned that the anti-Zionist campaign has succeeded in keeping these scholars off the syllabi. And so many American undergraduates who take courses on the history of the Middle East or of Israel are not exposed to the best scholars in Israel. That unspoken mantra, don't read what the Israelis have to say, unless like Avi Shavrit, they're willing to produce very questionable assertions about what happened in 1948, is succeeding. And I wondered what you had to say about that.
You want me to go first? Let me tackle it by saying this. When I first started teaching the class, and I used Charles Smith, there's a lot of primary documents in that book, and I used to feature readings from Herzl, selections from Benny Morris, things like that. I also am teaching a mid-level undergraduate course at Cal State Fullerton. So where they get a fuller treatment about this is from the textbook that I'm using now, where Shai Feldman is one of the co-authors and articulates and describes early Zionist thought, runs through some of in some of my lectures, I talk about that. So I'm not shying away from it and on purpose. It's more a matter of like, what can I get my students to actually read and in a weekly basis. So rather than have those large and sometimes challenging books to read and articles to read, I go for the sort of the textbook description of them. And that's why I do it. But I do acknowledge what you're saying. I think that's really important. It wasn't because I didn't want to. And I thought that Ari Shavit does handle a lot of those things. And I, by the way, I'd love to know what you think is questionable about his work. So you can talk to me about that later at some point. So I can have that as part of my lecture material.
Daphne, do you want to jump in? You are muted.
So I wanted to pull up my syllabus. I didn't. I'm not a political scientist, as I mentioned. I'm not a historian, so I'm working from a slightly different vantage point. But on my so I work with memoir, and I might be able to share my screen, but I'll just quickly say that I have on my list of memoirs, I do sort of a comparative analysis that Ron was talking about. So I have Youssef Bashir, Rachel Bialy, Ibrahim Jabra, Masoud Hayyoun, Ghada Karmi, Amos Oz, and Ayelet Sabari for the memoirs. And then in terms of theoretical critical texts, I have texts on memoir that probably wouldn't be as directly relevant to this conversation. I have Benedict Anderson's Imagined Communities. I have Judith Butler's Parting Ways. I have Esther Fuchs' Israeli Women's Studies, a reader. I have Palestinian Women Narrative Histories and Gendered Memory from Fatma Qassem. I have Rashid Khalidi's Palestinian Identity. And I have Emmanuel Levinas's Totality and Infinity, and I have Said's Reflections on Exile. So, you know, my approach here is to deal with the memoirs and then theoretical texts from a variety of different perspectives. And so I'm not sure that my perspective is exactly what you're looking for in terms of a response to your question, but I do take, I think, that the comparative framework that Ron was describing to heart. And so I'm similarly, I think, trying to draw from a variety of different points of view and text, cultural situationness in terms of theory and identity. It's really more about theorizing identity in the English department than it is, you know, bringing in, let's say, historians like Benny Morris. It just would be outside of my direct area of expertise as someone working within rhetoric and memoir.
Yeah, thanks, Jeffrey. An excellent question. I also don't have a satisfactory answer because I am also not a historian. I'm not even a political scientist per se. I'm an international relations scholar, which is a unique type of political science animal. So I need to clarify something though. When I say comparative, I don't primarily mean that I wish to represent different voices, although I do that too. I mean that I want to present Israel in the context of global events and geopolitics of the Middle East. So that when we study occupations, I'd like you to look at this occupation, but I'd like you to look at the 5 other occupations. And you may, you know, it may cross your mind that some of these occupations are more intense than others. And Israel is not at the top of that list. And if you're interested in fundamentalism, sure, we can talk about settlers and settler violence, but let's look at it in the context of other fundamentalisms. So I'm less about representation and voice. I don't teach history, Jeffrey, and so I don't assign any historians in my classes. I assign political scientists. Your question, though, I think is a very important one, and your suspicion may be true. I don't doubt it for a minute. It'd be an important topic to engage my colleagues in history on.
Yeah, as a historian of Germany, the political scientists who work on Europe and Germany, or the literary scholars who work on Europe, all of us could tell you 5, 10, 15, 20 scholars and intellectuals in Germany or France or Britain or Italy that we know of, whose work we know, and we know something about Italian intellectual life or German intellectual life. And what gets lost is that Israel has a very rich intellectual and scholarly life. There are really, really good scholars there. And the blackening of Israel's name in world politics has meant that a lot of academics act as if Israel doesn't have an intellectual and scholarly life that's worth taking account of, whether it's historians, literary critics, political scientists, international relations scholars, they're all there. I think it's important that that students in Hawaii or California or wherever are aware of them.
I think that's absolutely right. I think you're talking in a way to the wrong students. I think what you're pointing out would be very important in graduate classes. And we teach undergraduate classes. So I think it's just less relevant to undergraduate students who, as Scott said correctly, you know, rarely read. Guys, we can hear you talk. Rarely read firsthand history. You know, at best, if Daphne and Scott and I can get them to, you know, skim a reader or some historical abstract, then it's a big success. I share your suspicion of Ari Shavit. I think the self-flagellating and apologizing is I find it to be a little unnerving. But But yes, this would be a big issue to discuss with somebody who teaches PhD students. I think be an important issue to raise.
Thanks.
Could I just ask, what I was struck by is the fact that of the two sides, let's say the pro-Israel side or your side, I would probably put you on that, and the pro-Palestinian side, only your side will provide a comparative picture. The other side will not. And I was wondering whether and I was listening also to in Hawaii, what you did, you basically have competing events. You have, if you have an invited speaker for one side or an invited speaker for the other side, and you have self-selected audiences for each one. Would it be possible to have the university organize an event where you'd ask each side to identify a speaker and have each one present his own perspective and and then the other one, each side could challenge the other and would have to get a response. But it would have to be, but you'd have to insist upon respectful hearing of each side, no disruption. Would that be something possible? Is that too unrealistic to think eventually each side would have to listen to the other. You see what I mean? And also what I'm just wondering about is when you present the other side, the perspective of the other side, let's say when you presented Khalidi's book, do you not think that, you didn't agree with any of the arguments. Do you think that your sense of distaste for that did not also come through? That might not have been a fair presentation. This way, my suggestion would be each side would present its own perspective. Is that a possibility? Now, the audiences might sit on opposite sides of the room, sort of like at a wedding. You have a bride and a groom's side, but at least they would have to eventually listen to each other, may have to talk to each other. And, if they had enough of these events, it might be an improvement over what is happening now on the campuses. Though maybe
I'll take it first shot. So you raised, I think, three important issues. The first is, why are we the ones presenting both sides and the others aren't? That's because we're the good guys. The good guys present both sides. The professional scholars, the ones who take their job seriously, present both sides. The others are hacks. And I mean, in that sense, also people who only present the Israeli side or the pro-Zionist side or whatever that is, they're hacks. They're not scholars. So I think it's our obligation. I have not, but this is very much a personal opinion, I have not learned a great deal or enjoyed participating in quote unquote debates. I like bringing people into my classroom who can present a parallel argument, and I like having students read parallel arguments, but sitting on stage arguing with someone who holds really strong opinions that are diametrically opposed to mine, I don't find that those are great learning opportunities. And I'm also somewhat uncomfortable with them because, unlike my more progressive colleagues, I don't think this is about identity. In other words, I don't think you have done your diligence, but because there's a Palestinian on stage, so obviously they're going to present the best Palestinian case. And that dude, I think, he's wearing a kippah, so he's Jewish, so he's going to present the best Israeli case, and we're good, and we can probably split the difference. I actually think it is the duty of every scholar to present multiple sides, not just both sides, but 3 or 4 or 5 sides. And I think that has absolutely nothing to do with identity. So the scholars I bring into the classroom are neither Palestinian nor Israeli. They're just really good scholars. These big public events tend to be show trials. The students start cheering, whooping and hollering as if they were at a political rally. There's booing from the other side. It's not a great learning opportunity. And I think it is so important in a time when personal identity becomes conflated with scholarly identity, when we've started to sort of ad hominize our scholars, you know, oh, don't take a class with Ron because I hear his father is Israeli. I think precisely then it's important to show that I can make as sound an argument for Palestinian nationalism, maybe even a better one, than anyone who happens to carry a Palestinian passport in their pocket. So that's my personal point of view.